February 1889. The rails had been buried for 9 weeks, and the town of Deerfield, Oregon, was learning what it meant to be forgotten. The supply train that was supposed to arrive on December 3rd had not arrived. The one scheduled for December 17th had not arrived. The emergency shipment that the territorial governor had promised in January had not arrived either, because the Cascade passes were choked with snow 30 feet deep, and the locomotives that were supposed to clear them sat frozen on sidings 100 miles to the west, as useless as the promises of politicians. Deerfield had 260 souls, a general store with empty shelves, and a growing understanding that the civilization they had trusted to sustain them had simply stopped. The hunger announced itself in stages. First, the flour ran out, then the salt pork, then the cornmeal and the dried beans and the tinned goods that Fletcher Goddard had stocked in his mercantile at prices that had always been too high and were now entirely theoretical because there was nothing left to sell at any price. Children grew thin. The elderly grew quiet. A particular silence settled over the town, the silence of people conserving their energy because they did not know when they would eat again. But in a cabin on the hillside east of town, where the morning sun struck first and lingered longest, a woman named Hazel Drummond opened the door to her drying shed and surveyed her harvest. The shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling held what no store in Deerfield could offer: 512 pounds of dried fruit, packed in cloth sacks and sealed wooden boxes, organized by type and date. Apples sliced thin as paper and dried to supple leather, pears halved and honeyed before drying, their sweetness concentrated to an intensity that made the tongue ache. Plums transformed into dense, dark prunes that held the memory of summer in every wrinkled fold. Cherries, both sweet and sour, reduced to jewel-like morsels that could sustain a grown man through a day of labor on a handful. Blackberries and huckleberries dried on screens until they rattled like tiny stones, each one a capsule of nourishment. 512 pounds. 2 years of patient labor mocked every step of the way. Hazel closed the shed door, pulled her shawl tight against the cold, and walked to the stable where her sorrel mare, Maple, stood chewing hay with the placid contentment of a horse whose owner had planned ahead. She pressed her forehead against the mare's warm neck and allowed herself one moment of weariness before the work began. "Well, old girl," she said, "I suppose they'll be coming round soon." She had arrived in Deerfield in the autumn of 1885, a widow of 44 whose husband, George, had died that spring in a logging accident on the Willamette. A falling Douglas fir had caught him across the chest, and he had lived long enough to tell Hazel he loved her and to ask her to forgive the tree. She had done both, though the second had taken longer. George had left her with a modest sum from the logging company's conscience payment, $200, which the foreman had delivered in an envelope with an expression suggesting he hoped she would not make trouble. She had not made trouble. She had made plans. Hazel Drummond was not a woman given to despair. She was the daughter of a fruit farmer in the Willamette Valley, raised among orchards that produced apples and pears and cherries in quantities that staggered the imagination. Her mother, Constance, had been a master of preservation, a woman who could dry, can, pickle, and smoke the bounty of summer into provisions that would sustain a family through any winter, no matter how long or how lean. Constance had learned the art from her own mother, who had brought the knowledge from the hill country of Tennessee, where preserving food was not a hobby, but a matter of life and death. Hazel had absorbed these skills the way she had absorbed language, naturally, completely, without conscious effort. By the time she was 12, she could run a drying operation that would have impressed a commercial outfit. By 20, she could look at a piece of fruit and know its sugar content, its moisture level, its ideal drying time, and the precise moment at which to remove it from the heat before it crossed the line from preserved to ruined. After George's death, she had looked at a map and chosen Deerfield for one reason. The surrounding hills were thick with wild fruit. Crab apples and wild plums grew in the clearings. Huckleberries carpeted the high meadows. Blackberry brambles choked every fence line and abandoned homestead. And the old orchards planted by the first settlers, trees that had been neglected for years, their fruit falling ungathered to rot on the ground, still produced abundantly each autumn. Deerfield was drowning in fruit that nobody valued. Hazel valued it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in the mountains, the valleys, or somewhere the winters bite just as hard. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the supply train fails to arrive. She purchased 5 acres on the east-facing hillside above Deerfield, paying $30 for land that the seller considered barely worth the paper the deed was printed on. It was steep, rocky, unsuitable for farming or grazing, but it caught the morning sun, and the afternoon breeze swept across it reliably, and those two qualities made it perfect for what Hazel intended. She built her drying shed first, before she even built her cabin. It was a long, narrow structure, 24 feet by 10, with slatted walls that allowed air to circulate freely and a roof of cedar shakes that kept the rain off without trapping moisture. Inside, she installed wooden racks at 3 levels, waist height, shoulder height, and overhead, each one fitted with frames of cheesecloth stretched taut over pine borders. The frames could be slid in and out like drawers, allowing her to load and unload fruit without disturbing the pieces already drying. A small stone hearth at one end provided supplemental heat for the wet autumn days when the sun alone could not finish the job. She had learned from her mother that gentle heat and steady airflow were the secrets. Too much heat cooked the fruit rather than drying it, destroying the very nutrients that made preserved fruit worth eating. The cabin came second. It was modest. 1 room, a sleeping loft, a fieldstone hearth, and a covered porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the valley below. Maple had a lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north wall, snug and dry. The total cost of land, shed, and cabin came to $74. She began harvesting that first autumn, 1885, working from dawn until dark. She gathered wild plums from the creek bottoms, filling baskets that Maple hauled up the hill on a wooden sledge. She picked huckleberries on the high meadows, her hands stained purple for weeks. She collected fallen apples from the abandoned orchards, sorting them by ripeness, cutting away the bruised and wormy portions, slicing the good flesh into uniform rings that she laid on her drying frames with the precision of a jeweler setting stones. The drying process was an art refined over 3 generations. Each fruit required different treatment. Apples were cored, peeled, sliced to a 1/4-inch thickness, and dipped briefly in salted water to prevent browning before being laid on the frames. Pears were halved, their cores scooped out, brushed with a thin honey wash that enhanced their natural sweetness and gave the dried fruit a golden sheen. Plums were halved and pitted, laid cut side up to let the moisture escape gradually. Cherries were left whole, their stems removed, dried slowly at the lowest possible temperature to preserve their shape and flavor. The first batch, 40 pounds of dried apple rings, was ready by late October. Hazel brought a sample to Deerfield, offering it at Goddard's Mercantile for sale. Fletcher Goddard was the commercial heart of Deerfield, a stout man with a red beard and small, shrewd eyes who had positioned himself as the sole supplier of goods to the town. Everything came through Goddard: flour, sugar, coffee, tools, fabric, medicine. He set the prices. He extended the credit. He decided who prospered and who struggled. A woman selling dried fruit from a hillside shed was, at best, an irrelevance, at worst, a nuisance. He examined Hazel's apple rings with theatrical disdain, holding one up to the light, sniffing it, bending it between his thick fingers. "Dried fruit," he said flatly. "You want me to sell dried fruit." "I want to sell it myself," Hazel corrected. "I was hoping to set up a table outside your store on market days." Goddard's small eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Drummond, I stock everything this town needs, including dried fruit, when the supply train brings it from Portland. Proper dried fruit, processed by proper companies, in proper packaging. What you have here is," he gestured dismissively, "homemade. People want what they know. They want labels and brands, not something cooked up in a shed by a widow with time on her hands." "It isn't cooked," Hazel said mildly. "It's dried. There's a considerable difference." "The answer is no, Mrs. Drummond. You may not set up outside my store. It would give the wrong impression." The wrong impression, Hazel learned, was one that several prominent citizens of Deerfield shared. Sawyer Boggs, who owned the lumber mill and employed half the town's working men, declared at the saloon that the widow's fruit venture was a sad little enterprise born of a sad little life. His wife, Lucretia, organized a women's auxiliary meeting at the church to discuss the matter, concluding that Hazel's activities were eccentric and possibly unwholesome, and that no respectable woman would purchase fruit dried in an open-air shed where birds and insects had free access. "She means well, I'm sure," Mrs. Boggs told her circle. "But the poor creature has clearly been affected by her husband's passing. Drying fruit by the hundreds of pounds, it borders on mania." The shed acquired a name: the Widow's Madhouse. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. Hazel heard the mockery and continued her work. She had lived long enough to know that ridicule was the tribute that the idle paid to the industrious, and she was far too busy to collect it. Through 1886 and 1887, she expanded her operation. She planted 4 apple trees and 3 pear trees on her hillside, saplings that would take years to bear, but that represented an investment in the future. She cultivated blackberry canes along her fence line, training them on trellises that maximized sun exposure and made harvesting easier. She established a relationship with 2 hill families who lived higher up the valley, trading finished dried fruit for access to their wild huckleberry patches. Her methods grew more sophisticated. She experimented with different drying times, different temperatures, different pre-treatments. She discovered that plums dried at a slightly lower heat for a longer period produced prunes of superior texture and flavor. She learned that cherries dried over the stone hearth on rainy days, with the door cracked for ventilation, retained more color than those dried in full sun. She developed a method for pressing dried berries into dense cakes that could be wrapped in waxed cloth and stored indefinitely. Trail food that weighed almost nothing but packed extraordinary nourishment. She also learned to store her harvest properly. The drying shed was for processing, For storage, she built a separate structure, a cool, dark room dug into the hillside behind her cabin, lined with cedar planks to repel insects and moisture. The dried fruit went into cloth sacks inside sealed wooden boxes, each one labeled with the contents and the date of preparation. She kept a ledger, recording every pound processed, every pound consumed, every pound remaining. By the autumn of 1888, her ledger showed a reserve of 512 pounds. It was an extraordinary quantity, more than one woman and one horse could eat in 5 years. More than any reasonable assessment of personal need could justify. The people of Deerfield, who had been mocking her for 3 years, pointed to this surplus as final proof of her derangement. 500 pounds of dried fruit, Goddard reported at his store, shaking his head in wonderment. The woman has lost her mind entirely. Who needs 500 pounds of fruit? She'll be buried in prunes before she's buried in the ground. Sawyer Boggs laughed until his eyes watered. Perhaps she means to open a shop, he wheezed. Drummond's Dried Goods, specializing in madness by the pound. Hazel heard it all. She added another 20 pounds of dried pear to her stores and said nothing. The autumn of 1888 was wet. The rains came early and stayed late, saturating the mountain passes, weakening the rail beds, turning the crude roads that connected Deerfield to the wider world into rivers of mud. The supply train that arrived on November 15th would be the last. Nobody knew this at the time. The railroad had not announced any disruption. The schedules posted at the depot showed trains arriving every 2 weeks through the winter, as they always had. But the schedules were printed in Portland by men who had never seen a Cascade winter, and the winter of 1888 to 89 would make liars of them all. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The first missed train caused little concern. Delays were common in winter. The second missed train produced unease. The third, the one that should have arrived on December 31st, carrying not only general supplies but the special holiday provisions that families had ordered weeks in advance, produced something closer to alarm. By mid-January, the alarm had become dread. Goddard's mercantile, which had entered the winter modestly stocked, began to run dry. The flour went first, always the flour, because it was the foundation of every frontier kitchen, the ingredient without which bread and biscuits and gravy and a dozen other staples could not be made. Then the sugar, then the coffee, which the loggers and mill workers depended upon the way a preacher depends upon Scripture. Then the salt pork and the tinned goods and the dried beans, until the shelves that had once groaned with abundance stood as bare and accusing as a guilty conscience. Goddard rationed what remained. He raised his prices, not gradually, but brutally, the way a man raises a weapon when he feels threatened. Flour went from $2 a sack to $5, then $8, then $12. Families who had been living comfortably discovered that comfortable was a temporary condition, entirely dependent on a supply chain that had snapped like a rotten rope. The hunger set in during February. Not the dramatic starvation of a besieged city, but the slow, grinding deprivation of a community that was simply running out. Meals shrank from 3 to 2 to 1. Mothers fed their children and ate nothing themselves. The elderly, as they so often did, suffered in silence, unwilling to burden their families with the inconvenience of their need. 2 people died that month. Old Garfield Symes, a retired logger who lived alone, was found in his cabin with an empty larder and a full woodpile, warm but starved. And the infant daughter of the Navarro family, who had been failing since January, slipped away on a Tuesday night while her mother sang to her in Spanish, a lullaby about a land where the fruit trees never stopped bearing. Hazel Drummond heard about the deaths on a Wednesday morning from one of the Hill families who still visited her. She stood in her drying shed, surrounded by the abundance that 3 years of labor had produced, and made her decision without hesitation. She loaded Maple's sledge with 100 pounds of dried fruit, apples, pears, plums, cherries, berry cakes, and drove down the hill into Deerfield. She set up outside Goddard's empty mercantile, on the same spot where he had refused to let her sell 3 years prior. She arranged her goods on a makeshift table of planks and sawhorses, and she waited. The first to approach was a boy of perhaps 10, his face gaunt beneath a wool cap that was too large for his shrunken head. He stared at the dried fruit with eyes that held both hunger and disbelief, as if he had stumbled upon something that could not possibly exist. "Take some," Hazel said gently. "Take as much as you need. There's no charge." The boy looked at her, looked at the fruit, looked back at her. Then he grabbed a double handful of dried apple rings and ran. Within the hour, the word had spread. The widow on the hill had food. The mad woman with her shed full of dried fruit, the laughingstock, the eccentric, the lonely soul with her 500 pounds of prunes, had what Goddard's store did not, what the railroad could not deliver, what money could not buy. They came in a steady stream, mothers with children balanced on their hips, loggers with the shame of hungry men on their weathered faces, the elderly, supported by younger arms, moving slowly through the cold toward a table piled with sweetness. Hazel distributed her stores with calm efficiency, measuring portions by family size, ensuring that each household received enough to last a week. She showed them how to reconstitute the dried fruit in warm water, how to simmer it into a thick compote that stretched further and satisfied longer than eating it dry. She demonstrated her berry cakes, explaining that a single cake the size of a man's palm contained enough nourishment for a day's labor. She returned the next day with another 100 pounds, and the next, and the next. For 5 weeks, Hazel Drummond fed Deerfield. She rose before dawn each morning, loaded her sledge, drove Maple down the frozen hill, and distributed her harvest to whoever came. She supplemented the fruit with whatever else she had: dried venison from the Hill families, potatoes from her root cellar, eggs from her 3 chickens that had continued to lay throughout the winter in their snug coop beside the cabin. The dried fruit proved more sustaining than anyone had expected. It was dense with sugar and fiber and the concentrated essence of summer. Children who ate it regained their color within days. Adults who had grown listless and weak found their strength returning. The berry cakes, in particular, became a revelation: portable, durable, and astonishingly nourishing. They kept the mill workers on their feet when nothing else could. Fletcher Goddard watched from his empty store with an expression that shifted over the course of those 5 weeks, from resentment to bewilderment to something that might, in a more generous man, have been shame. His shelves were bare. His prices were irrelevant. His monopoly on the town's sustenance had been broken not by a competitor, but by a widow with a drying shed and 3 years of patience. Sawyer Boggs watched as well. His mill had shut down in January. No supplies, no market, no point. His workers were among those lining up at Hazel's table. His wife, Lucretia, who had called Hazel's enterprise unwholesome and eccentric, was seen one morning accepting a bag of dried pears with her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. The supply train finally arrived on March 9th, 1889, 96 days after the last delivery. The locomotive came through the pass trailing steam and triumph, its cars loaded with flour and coffee and everything else that Deerfield had been denied. The town greeted it with a relief that bordered on hysteria, but the celebration was tempered by a reckoning that could not be postponed. A gathering was called for the following Sunday, held in the church because it was the largest building in town and because the occasion seemed to demand the gravity of sacred ground. Every surviving resident attended. Fletcher Goddard asked to speak first. He walked to the front of the assembly with the heavy steps of a man approaching a confession he had been rehearsing for weeks. 3 years ago, he said, his voice stripped of its usual bluster, a woman came to my store with a sample of dried fruit and asked to sell it from a table outside my door. I refused her. I told her that people wanted proper goods from proper companies. I told her that homemade fruit from a hillside shed was beneath the standards of my establishment. He paused. His red beard trembled. My establishment has been empty for 3 months. My shelves have held nothing but dust and shame. And the woman I refused, the woman this town called mad, called eccentric, called the widow with the madhouse, that woman fed your families when I could not. She fed my family, though I gave her every reason to let us go hungry. He turned to face Hazel, who sat in her usual place near the back. Mrs. Drummond, I was wrong. About your fruit. About your methods. About you. I am a merchant who had nothing to sell. You were a woman who had everything to give. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I ask for it nonetheless. Sawyer Boggs rose next. The mill owner, who had laughed until his eyes watered at the idea of 500 pounds of dried fruit, could barely meet the eyes of the congregation. My wife told her circle that Mrs. Drummond's operation was unwholesome, he said quietly. My wife ate Mrs. Drummond's pears last month and wept because they tasted like summer and she had forgotten what summer tasted like. He shook his head. I called her enterprise a sad little project, born of a sad little life. I was describing my own character, not hers. Others spoke, the mothers who had fed their children, the loggers whose strength had been sustained, the elderly who had survived because a woman they never spoke to had thought of them anyway. When the confessions had run their course, Hazel Drummond stood. She was not a tall woman, but something in the way she held herself, straight-backed, clear-eyed, unhurried, gave her a presence that filled the room. My mother taught me to dry fruit, she said simply. Her mother taught her. It was not cleverness or prophecy that filled my shed. It was habit. The habit of women who understood that summer does not last, that trains do not always run, that the only provision you can truly depend upon is the one you make with your own hands. She looked around the church. I did not dry 500 pounds of fruit to prove a point. I dried it because waste offends me. Every autumn, fruit falls from the trees around this town and rots on the ground. Perfectly good food, left to the worms and the weather, while this community trusts its survival to a railroad schedule printed in Portland by men who have never spent a winter here. Her voice softened. I am not angry with any of you. Mockery is the sound people make when they do not understand something. Now you understand. And if you wish to learn, I will teach you. The fruit is there for the taking. The sun is free. The knowledge is simple. No family in this valley need ever go hungry again if they are willing to do the work. Thank you for watching this story about Hazel Drummond and the drying shed of Deerfield. In times of plenty, preservation looks like paranoia. In times of scarcity, it looks like prophecy. If this story reminded you that the old ways exist for a reason, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever called your preparations unnecessary until the day they weren't? That summer, 11 drying sheds appeared on the hillsides around Deerfield, each one built under Hazel's patient instruction. She taught the women, and more than a few of the men, the art her mother and grandmother had perfected. She showed them how to select fruit at its peak, how to prepare it for drying, how to regulate heat and airflow, how to store the finished product for years if necessary. Fletcher Goddard added a dried fruit section to his mercantile, stocked exclusively with locally produced goods. He displayed them prominently with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Deerfield's finest, prepared by our own." He charged a fair price and paid his suppliers fairly in return. It was, he admitted to Hazel one afternoon, the most honest business he had ever conducted. Lucretia Boggs became one of Hazel's most devoted students, eventually producing dried pear that Hazel herself declared equal to her own. The two women, who had never exchanged a civil word before the famine, became unlikely companions, spending autumn afternoons together on Hazel's porch, slicing fruit and watching the valley below fill with the gold of turning leaves. The phrase "filling the shed" became common wisdom in Deerfield. It meant preparing for hardship during times of ease, preserving today's abundance against tomorrow's scarcity. It was spoken with quiet conviction, as if the speaker had learned its meaning through experience that left no room for doubt. Hazel Drummond lived on her hillside for another 27 years, drying fruit until her hands could no longer hold the knife. She passed in the spring of 1916, at the age of 75, and was buried beside George in the cemetery overlooking the valley. Maple had preceded her by a decade, buried near the drying shed where the mare had waited so many patient mornings while her mistress loaded the sledge. The drying shed still stands. The cedar shakes have been replaced 3 times, and the racks have been rebuilt twice. But the structure is Hazel's, and the families who maintain it follow her methods precisely. Each autumn, when the fruit comes ripe, women gather there to continue the work that a widow began with nothing but grief and knowledge and the stubborn conviction that summer's bounty should never be wasted. Above the door, in letters carved by a hand that knew more about fruit than about carpentry, is an inscription that Hazel placed there in 1890, the year after the famine. Summer forgets, the shed remembers. Her mother Constance, who had carried the knowledge from Tennessee, would have recognized every word.